Welcome everybody to this seminar, which is jointly arranged by the Environmental Economics Unit and also FRAM, the Center for Future Chemical Risk Assessment and Management, which is one of the UGOP centers here. And we normally live stream and record our seminars, so welcome also to those who are watching this online. So my name is Daniel Strömier. I'm an environmental economist, and I'm also active within FRAM, which is a multidisciplinary center, which is led by a professor in ecotoxicology. I think he will jump through the door soon. And we are also some lawyers and economists in this, trying to look at chemicals from a social science perspective, how to manage. And today we are most happy to welcome Associate Professor Silke Gabbert from the University of Wageningen, where she is in the Environmental Economics group. And she is particularly working in this area of chemicals risk management. Right. Maybe you want to add something to that presentation later on. She will talk about socioeconomic analysis of persistent chemicals under REACH, European Chemicals Legislation. Where is the economics in that? I think that's an excellent question, because sometimes we are a bit confused by all this nitty-gritty chemical terminology and so on. But I think there's a big need for more economists entering in this field. So she will present, and then there will be some room for discussion and questions. So, very welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much, Daniel. And thank you all for inviting me, for the opportunity to be here today. It's my first time to be in Gothenburg, so not the first time in Sweden. I told to Daniel already that more than 20 years ago I was walking a part of the Kungsleden together with my brother, which was really a fabulous experience. And I'm happy to be here today to present a bit of my work, but also I'm very curious to learn about yours, and I hope that we get into a constructive discussion and an exchange of our ideas and visions. As Daniel already said, the presentation is about socioeconomic analysis of persistent chemicals under REACH. This is a group of chemicals which is abbreviated with PBT, or very persistent, very bioaccumulative, VP, VB. I will come back to that in a few minutes. And this group is particularly interesting because it belongs to the group of substances of very high concern. And this is a subgroup which receives particular attention in the regulatory process of REACH. By the way, feel free to interrupt me during the presentation if anything is unclear, or if you have a question or a comment. That's very much appreciated. Now I have structured the presentation into these parts. I was not sure in the beginning when I worked on the slides how much you know about that process. Therefore, I say a few words about the regulatory background and the overall setting in which the socioeconomic analysis takes place. Then I zoom in to the group of persistent chemicals, explain the regulatory procedure, the concern that is associated with this group of chemicals, and the challenges that these concerns raise with regard to socioeconomic analysis. I will then present a benchmark model that is looking into the features of economic decision-making. So suppose that we would have a perfect database on all the things that we need to know. What is then the decision rule? What is then the economic rationale of regulating these chemicals? This is followed by a short reality check, so saying how is it currently done and what is really feasible. And in the end, I will say a few words about a proposed framework, which is the result of a project that I coordinated last year for the European Commission, looking also specifically into the issue of impact assessment of PBTs and VP-VBs. Now, REACH is the chemicals legislation which has a number of, let's say, very relevant and important heavy aims. the most important of which is to ensure a high level of protection to human health and to the environment, at the same time not distracting the free circulation of chemicals and even enhancing the competitiveness and the innovativeness of chemicals industry in Europe. There are few main components of the regulation. Maybe you all know about this already, so I will go about it shortly. The first is the registration phase. Chemicals which are produced or marketed above 1 ton per year need to be registered, meaning that a supplier or manufacturer or downstream user has to submit a quite detailed set of data to ECHA, to the European Chemicals Agency. This phase is now ending at the end of March this year, so then the registration phase will be completed. In the follow-up, and also already ongoing since 2007, since REACH entered into force, is the evaluation phase. Evaluation refers first of all to the way how the substances were tested, so how the toxicological, the hazard and risk information is generated, but also regarding the completeness of the dossier submitted and the evaluation of the substances as such. The two main regulatory instruments of REACH are the authorization and the restriction procedure. They both aim to control or adequately control and to the largest extent possible phase out particularly harmful substances, but they also differ in a number of features. Now, the authorization is an instrument where the producer, so firms, private actors, need to apply for. In contrast to that, in a restriction case, the member state authority, so a regulatory agency of a national member state, has to request. Another key difference is that the authorization applies to substances of very high concern only, so a very specific subgroup of the entire sample of chemicals, whereas the restriction process is open to any type of substance. Now, the aims differ, whereas in the case of authorization, the applicant should show, or the aim is to move to a progressive replacement of these substances of very high concern. In the restriction process, it is more about stopping the manufacture and marketing of a substance unless they comply with specific risk control measures. Now, coming to the instrument of socio-economic analysis, this is a mandatory part of an authorization application. So the decision is based on this socio-economic analysis. It must be included in the application documents. In the case of a restriction, this is a bit different. It can be included. That's what the legal texts say, or what the documents say. But it is also highly recommended, because if a regulatory agency thinks that a substance should be restricted, a socioeconomic analysis is very beneficial to show that the proposed restriction measure is really proportional. What is a socioeconomic analysis? I think the question is justified to be raised, because it's not really clear from the outset what it means. Depending on the perspective, so whether you go for an authorization aiming at keeping a substance in use from the perspective of a firm, or from a restriction angle aiming at taking the substance out of use unless except for the restrictive measures, it's always a balancing of, let's say, the pros and cons. And in economic terms, you would phrase it a balancing of benefits and costs. And of course, what defines to be a benefit and what defines a cost is dependent on the perspective that you take. Generally, there is a societal perspective regarding benefits and costs. So it is not just the gains and losses for a firm. There should be a broader perspective, keeping an eye on the positive and negative impacts on society as a whole. Now, Under which circumstances is now a chemical that is regulated or that is eligible in the REACH process entering an authorization or a restriction? First of all, if a substance is identified as a substance of very high concern, it can be proposed to be included in a so-called candidate list. Once a substance of very high concern is in the candidate list, a prioritization process may move this substance or include it into another list, which is the so-called authorization list. This prioritization procedure is explained in a document that you find on the ECHA website. It considers substance properties, but also whether the substance is wide dispersively used or not, and the relevance this substance has for society. Once a substance of very high concern entered the authorization list, it will become subject to authorization because there will be a sunset date after which the use and manufacture is prohibited unless a firm or a group of firms has submitted this application for authorization. And once this is the case, let's say the machinery starts, so the applicant has to submit an authorization dossier, as part of which there is a socioeconomic analysis to be performed. Under the authorization path, two different lines, or let's say subpaths, are distinguished for substances of very high concern. The one is the adequate control route, which means that if an applicant can show that the exposure is controlled such that there is no risk for society, then the socioeconomic analysis is just aiming at showing how this economic adequate control should take place. But for the case of persistent chemicals, this adequate control route is ruled out by the outset because PBTs have the concern that there are no thresholds, so you cannot document under which circumstances an exposure is considered to be harmful or not. There is no, let's say, yes, no, dangerous, not dangerous threshold. Therefore, PBTs enter the so-called socio-economic route to authorization. It is important to keep in mind that at each of these prior stages, so the identification as an SVHC, the inclusion into the candidate list or into the authorization list, a restriction proposal can be submitted by a member state. So you can factually prevent a persistent chemical from entering the authorization process by submitting a restriction dossier. But keep in mind that here the responsibility is on the side of the member state, whereas here it is on the side of the private firms. Looking at the ECHA website, you find a lot of information on the number of persistent chemicals that are currently included either in the authorization or in the restriction process. So you see that on the list of SVHCs, we have currently 13 substances which are only PBT, 10 which are only FEP, FEB, and 21 which are considered to be both. And regarding restriction proposals, at least those which have already been adopted and therefore documented, we have 5 persistent chemicals. Now a few words of what creates the regulatory concern on these chemicals. I should start with this slide first. Now,
can I ask something?
yes, of course.
Below the table?
Yes.
In the candidate list, you have 30 substances that comply with one of those criteria, right?
Yes.
Out of 150 something that
Even more, I think. It's 161, if I am correctly informed.
is that any proportion of kind of the proportion proportion of substances of high concern that can have this property? Is it representative, or do you know something about that?
This is difficult to say, because what do you consider to be representative? I mean, an equal proportion could be more or less representative. What do you mean with representativeness? Regarding the entire, let's say, sample of chemicals that is on the...
Exactly. Because you have like a simple statistic will say that 1/5 of the substances have this property, right?
Mhm.
Would that be a good indicator of the share of substances of high concern that have those properties? Just to know the magnitude of the problem.
I don't think so that this is a good criterion, because the prioritization process puts quite strong weight on the concern of PBT or FeB chemicals. So there is a quite high likelihood that once a substance is really persistent, so falling or characterized as PBT, FeB, that it's quite likely that it receives a high score in this prioritization machine and is then entering the list. And the tonnage volume is another indicator. So there are, let's say, trade-offs between them, but in the end they are aggregated into a score. If the score is high, then there is a flow on the authorization list. If it's relatively low, then not. So what is the concern that is assumed or associated with persistent chemicals? First of all, as let's say the acronyms already say, they are P, B, and T, or FeB, meaning that we have a combined, a multidimensional hazard or harm profile of these chemicals, and we cannot assume that the overall harm is just a linear aggregate of the individual components. These substances, just because they are persistent, have a high potential to accumulate in the environment over time. And even if you stop your emissions, you cannot assume that they degrade completely and degrade quickly. So they can remain in the environment for decades, and therefore the pollution problem persists and maintains even if the production of a substance has stopped and emissions have ceased completely. Another issue that is widely discussed in the literature is their potential to be transported to and contaminate remote areas. But there are also other issues which you not directly find in the legislation, but in the corresponding policy documents. One of these you find in the guidance of REACH, R11, is that these safe concentration levels, which can then, or which are assumed to enable us to say when a certain exposure concentration is becoming a problem or not, these safe concentration levels cannot be determined for persistent chemicals. It is the argument following up on that premise is that there is hardly any means of assessing the risk in a quantitative way, so by means of a PEG-PNEG ratio, for example. And as a follow-up argument, it is often stated that you also can't move forward to an impact assessment, meaning that a damage assessment, as economists would do it, is not possible. And another very important pattern of these chemicals is that because they have long-term effects, there is a lot of uncertainty underlying to any form of assessment, because we simply don't know what may happen in, let's say, 20 or 30 years. So if you keep in mind that under the authorization route, a socioeconomic analysis is required, it's really an obligation. Under the restriction process, it is at least strongly recommended. And now look at the arguments that I presented on the previous two slides. There is a dilemma, because we need to come up with some assessment, or at least an evaluation of benefits and costs, impacts and risks. But according to the argumentation, there is hardly any grip on both aspects. So how shall we deal with that? And how can we really transport what we know, because it's not that we don't know anything, but at least how can we exploit existing knowledge such that we can ensure transparent and coherent decision making on these substances. From an economic perspective, this raises three fundamental questions. First of all, what are now the economic features of the pollution problem that is created by PBTs or FEBs? What is, given these features, the economic structure of the decision problem, and what defines a concern-based regulation of these group of chemicals? And the third one is, once we have understood that, what is really feasible given the information and the data we have? I just need to take out my bottle of water. Just a second. No, I think I forgot it upstairs. No, doesn't matter.
Can you survive, or should I?
I can survive, yeah. It's just sometimes nice to drink something in between, but I fully survive. Now, with these questions in mind, I have been working on a model that, let's say, is defined a benchmark model for the intention that I am, of course, aware that we will not be able to run such a fancy economic model in practice, but still we need to understand what is really the underlying issue, what is the feature in a decision-making process. And the key starting point of any such assessment is that these persistent chemicals create stock externalities. That's a term that has been widely used in environmental economics, and you find it in almost every textbook. It means that just because chemicals are persistent and because they accumulate in the environment, they generate an intertemporal or even intergenerational pollution problem. You move from a focus on point estimates to a dynamic model where you use this differential equation that you see here. This equation just means that the change of stock, so what you accumulate as an exposure concentration in your environment or in a certain compartment, is a function of what you put in, and this is your emission or your release, and what is going out per period. This is your decay that you can calculate from, for example, the information about the degradation half-life. This is not new in economics. It has been dealt with for more than 30 years with a number of applications with regard to climate change, waste management, water contaminants, and so forth. But what does it mean with regard to that specific context that we face here? Now, we can solve this differential equation as you see it here above. Is there also a pointer? Ah, yeah, here. Then you see that you get this nasty constant, but this constant has an expression which you can then reinsert into your equation, and you get a quite interesting equation that says that the expected stock at any period t is a function of the initial stock, so your background concentration that you already have when you start doing your assessment, your emissions x, and the chemicals decay in t. This is how I usually present this to my students. I have a very simple model, a discrete model, where I say, assume now that we have constant emissions for a period of, for 6 periods. At period 1, there is a pollution signal, so some pollutant is going into the environment, for example, into soil. And throughout the entire time frame, it is, of course, degrading. But if you continue emitting, what happens? Every period, another signal is coming, so the pollution is just added on top of what is already there. And if the emission rate exceeds your degradation rate, your environmental concentrations start to accumulate and after a while converge towards the compartment-specific or medium-specific steady state. This is a graph that shows you just a few issues if you have a more longer time frame. So it's a hypothetical substance. Don't look here into the real numbers. But what we distinguish is a high, a mean, and a low reaction half-life. And it's also important to know that we have a period of about 20 years where we have constant emissions. And then suppose that we would just stop and look what happens in the environment. And you see, with our simplified assumptions of constant emissions, the concentrations will accumulate under all scenarios. Also, the final exposure levels after 20 years differ, which is a result of different levels of persistence, you could say. And when we stop, also the time that it takes for the substance to degrade differs considerably. Now, in a socioeconomic analysis, where we compare the benefits of use against the potential damages to the environment and to human health, it is of course completely inappropriate just to focus on the period until the year 20, unless you emit. Also, the benefits of use may stretch only for these 20 years. But the damage costs that need to be put on the other side of the coin in this balancing process are the damages that arise in this entire time period and not only the 20 years. So in this benchmark model, we assumed that we would know everything. So we could specify a benefits function, and we did it really easy because economists are simple-minded. They like to start from the most simple level and then proceed to more complex levels. So we assume that the benefits are just a linear function depending on some market valuation factor B and your emissions X. The damages, because damages do not depend on emissions, but they depend on the stock. The relevant variable is not what I blow into the air, but what ends up in my environmental compartments, and this is the stock. So emissions influence the pollution problem only indirectly. That's a really important issue that cannot be said often enough. And therefore, the damage function is not necessarily a linear function. It can be linear, but I think this is really, really unlikely. Therefore, if we now would compare the damages against the benefits, and assuming that there is a decision maker, which is maybe a regulator, what would this agency or this person do? The standard economic rationale of, let's say, continuing the use of a persistent chemical is that the net present value, so the stream of benefits, must exceed the stream of costs. But recognizing and acknowledging that this stream of costs consists of those early damage costs, so damages that arise during the period where the substance is in use, plus the late damage costs. And they can be quite high because this degradation can spread over long periods of time. R here is the discount rate. The discount rate is, let's say, used to make streams of benefits and costs that occur at different points in time comparable to each other. But there is much more to say about it because it matters whether or not R is positive and what kind of discounting approach we use. But I can come back to that a bit later.
Can I ask you something?
Yes.
So if you go back to that slide,
Yeah.
But of course, a clear problem here is that if persistent is also there is uncertainty about it, right? If you would know it for sure, then we will not have problems.
Yeah.
To make the analysis.
Yeah.
So what you call like damage cost, it's a probabilistic, it's a value.
These are the expected damage costs. Yes, yes. Yeah. So you can, of course, immediately have a distribution function here, but in the setting where you just want to demonstrate the features, we had it as a almost discretized setting. Still, we keep here the dynamics because we have not just point estimates, but we have the integers. So we look at the damages, which are the areas under the curves that we observe.
Yeah, but it just occurs to me that when it comes to this probabilistic component,
Mhm.
you have the same problem in issues like transport of dangerous material, right? Where there is a risk that something very, very bad happens and might last over time.
Yes.
So the uncertain component is important in terms of the policy issue,
Yeah.
because you could think about some sort of deposit bond or something that
Yeah.
forces to be more precautionary in a way.
Yeah, I think that's a very relevant argument, which I am asked quite often. What might happen, let's say, far in the future, which is unknown to all of us, can of course not immediately be made visible in a numerical, quantitative approach. Nevertheless, it's not that you keep fully blank here. You can, of course, model the corridor in which your pollution problem may exist. So here you can at least integrate your uncertainty by having this corridor according to your information or to the lack of information, larger or smaller. But that's true. Let's say the period where we just can make our decisions based on point estimates is gone. That's not possible anymore with this type of problem. With this equation, the interest or the intention is to reformulate it such that we can say something about what is the critical pollution level, when should a decision maker stop, how long may such a substance remain in use, or even more importantly, what is the critical concentration where the system starts to turn. It is, technically speaking, just a matter of reformulating this equation. So if we do that, we get this expression here that says, or which is a necessary condition for an optimal period of use T of such a persistent chemical. And you see already that here the marginal damages equal marginal costs here. And this latter expression is just composed by the parameters, the degradation, the decay, the discount rate, your stock in the environment, and this beta. And the beta is the curvature of your damage function. So the relationship between what you find in the environment and the severity of harm that you think is caused by this exposure. So if you say, if you would think that there is just a linear relationship between the two, so you pollute, your stock increases, and your harm increases proportionally, then your decision rule boils down to a no or never decision. So you always have corner solutions. If your marginal damages exceed the marginal benefits at the first period, they will always exceed it, so you would never use your substance. Whereas if the marginal damages benefits exceed the marginal damages, you have just the other situation. It would tell you go on forever. This is a very, very unlikely situation because even with the little evidence that we have regarding the relationship between the stock, the impacts, and how people would value the severity of impacts, it is much more likely to assume that this beta is larger than 1, so that we have at least a quadratic damage function, as it is used also in many cases of climate change modeling. For example, the DICE model uses a quadratic damage function. And then it means that your critical pollution level depends on the parameters and the knowledge of these parameters that you see here in, just a second, this equation. You may get an interior solution, meaning that you may be able to define when your system, your balancing between benefits and costs, is turning such that marginal damages increase marginal benefits and that you have to stop. But you may, depending on the values of your parameters, also have corner solutions. You see that the higher marginal benefits, the higher the decay rate and the higher your discount rate is, the longer you will keep a persistent chemical in use and the higher the environmental pollution level is that you would tolerate according to this net present value decision rule that I showed you above. Likewise, if your alpha, so your scaling factor of damages, is very high, the lower your optimal period of use would be. But as I said, this is a benchmark model, meaning that we are well aware that all these parameters might not be readily available for, let's say, about the 250 PBTs that are important under REACH. So still, what can we do with it? First of all, knowing about the stock dynamics is just the first step. It's a necessary step, but you are not there once you have modeled your stock dynamics, because you need to translate the information about environmental concentrations into a time-dependent relationship between concentrations and impact. So it's comparable to a dose-response type of information. I see that over time something is happening in soil or water or air or sediment, for example. But what does this mean? What is the observable harm over time that I get? And even more, if we want to value it, if we want to, we don't have to, but if we want to it, we even need to attach some values. So how severe do we judge, perceive these impacts to be? My experience is that the story ends here. Oh, now the pointer is even stopping. The story ends at the level of impact assessment. I will show you in a few minutes a proposal how these impacts can be evaluated, but if you then want to move forward to a monetary valuation, it gets really, really difficult because the necessary method development and corresponding to that, the time and resource investments to get this information for persistent chemicals has simply not been provided. There is a need, if we really want to move forward to a monetary or valued assessment of impacts, to make these investments. I do not say that it's not possible, but the current level of knowledge is very, very scattered. So, yeah.
But it will depend on what are the fact that you are kind of interested in. If you think about DDT, DDT is well studied, right?
Yes.
So probably there are studies that look into the effect, environmental effect on some kind of aspect that can be quantified through these market values, loss of productivity or effect on some sort of input, right?
Yeah.
I mean, just having some sort of idea of the magnitude of would be...
Yeah. We applied the model to DDT just because we also thought this is one of the best studied persistent chemical that we have. We have a long, let's say, history of research here. There is a lot of knowledge that became available so far. But the point is, it's not that you only need some estimates about, let's say, the gross concentrations in the environment. You need to get or to narrow down this information to how is the concentration changing over time, and then it gets already much more difficult, and what is the change of our impacts over time. And we looked into the available data. So what you indeed can do is to get information about benchmarks or some threshold levels in different environmental compartments. But estimating or extrapolating something like a dose-response-like impact curve was, even for DDT, very difficult. And the point is, you may be able to do that for specific PBTs. I don't doubt about that. But in a regulatory system like REACH, you want applicants doing that at the broad scale. And this is what it makes really difficult, because it is not just an issue of a few weeks, I would say. You really require a lot of time, a lot of manpower to do that. I mean, I would be happy to further develop these tools up to that stage and automate them such they can be really applied. Yeah, but we are still not there.
But I mean, a very clear simplification would be just to try to estimate some sort of like
Yeah.
biodegradability
Yeah.
rate in labs,
Yeah.
and then just apply linear models, right?
Yeah, I will show you in 5 minutes or so how we did this for the chemicals that we evaluated in the project for the Commission. Just look at the time.
Yeah,
Are we very tight?
Yeah, a few more minutes, and
Oh.
then I would like to more questions.
Okay, I do my very best. So here you see the substances that I showed you in the table before. Now you see the names of those for which authorization decisions are ongoing, or let's say at least the process has been started. And these are the restriction proposals that have been adopted. So you can see, you can download all these dossiers from the ECHA website. Now, last year, as I said, I worked on a project where we exactly wanted to see what is really possible. Suppose that you are an applicant, what kind of tools do you have in order to evaluate the impacts of these PBT substances? We also were asked by the Commission to test the proposed framework to a set of 17 substances, including siloxanes, flame retardants, PFCs, pesticides, phenols, and PAHs. So a quite broad range, and also a range where we could assume already from the very beginning that the data availability is varying strongly. And then the interest behind that is how we can transform an evaluation of impacts into a framework that allows us to compare it with costs of abatement or emission control in a cost-effectiveness analysis framework. Because at the policy level, there is a strong preference not to go for a monetary valuation, but to, let's say, have the second best tool, which is cost-effectiveness analysis. Now, this is just a little plot of the approach. What you see from a first glance is that we structured it as an iterative procedure. It stretches over 5 different stages, and you see that it includes both environmental modeling, toxicological assessments, and economics. And these tools can be flexibly combined with each other, so you are not forced now to start with stage 1 and move down to stage 5. You can also, let's say, pick out some of the stages depending on the level of assessment that you want to provide. We expanded the stock pollution model such that we allow now for multimedia stock pollution assessment. Instead of focusing on only soil or only sediment, we allow for intermedia distribution issues of PBTs. But you see that even this is already quite an effort, because it takes a couple of steps, starting that you need to define the uses, as you also did it in the study that you showed me today, and then move forward to the different emission scenarios that you look at. Essentially, in a nutshell, it's a combination of the stock dynamics that I showed you earlier and multimedia fate modeling. Just a few words about one specific example picked out from the sample of 17 chemicals. This is PFOS, including PFOS substance as the substance as such, and PFOS salts. The interesting thing with PFOS is that it has multiple current uses. It has also past uses, but they more or less were taken out after the main manufacturer, 3M, I think, stopped on the production of PFOS. But it is used in a broad range of different applications, and it is a strongly persistent chemical, so it's assumed to be not degradable in water, soil, and in sediment. Now, we tried first, or we started first with the assessment of stock dynamics. These are some of the data we considered. And we also looked into different emission scenarios because every application, every dossier needs to make this comparison. We contrasted an ongoing use with ongoing constant emissions to an emission stop after a couple of years, so we assumed 6 years, and to a linear emission reduction. Here you see the behavior, so the stock dynamics that you get for soil, and you see that, let's say, the damages, which is always the area under your entire time path, is of course different depending on the emission scenario that you assume. So the transformation of stock information into impacts is also depending on the type of your emission scenario. Here you see stock dynamics for water, and you see that this is already a completely different picture. Although we have one and the same emission stream, but the emissions, of course, are distributed into different release paths. So what is emitted is not going in equal proportions to the different compartments, and there are volatilization processes, there are these intercompartmental distribution processes, there is leaching, which causes the substance to go out of water much quicker than out of the soil. So the problem, at least from the issue of exposure concentrations, seems to be more severe in soil than in water. What does this mean for the impact evaluation? These 3 more slides, then I'm done. Again, we have to differentiate between the different data availabilities, and therefore we distinguished 3 different routes. We assumed that if there is no information about impact, so it's really nothing available that we can say what type of harm is caused, we can still use the stock as a proxy for impact because impacts arise from the stock and not from the emissions. Route 2 would mean that we transform the stock at least into a natural units-based impact curve, meaning that we have, for example, toxicological benchmark values that we can plot in the stock dynamics, or that we even can apply probabilistic modeling if we have dose response data available, and then use the concept of species sensitivity distributions to construct a time-specific impact curve. Route 3, as I said, a monetization of impacts, was one of the theoretical options we considered, but we did not test it because with a project that stretches over a year and where the Commission needed quite some time to get the administration done, it was simply not possible. But interestingly, what you see here is a local pollution scenario for PFOS, where we applied these 2 routes of impact assessment based on toxicological thresholds. You see these here in colored lines, and you see that in the assessment period of 12 years, we are above these thresholds for most scenarios, but if we then apply one of the control scenarios, so either an emission stop or a linear reduction, that at least in water at the local scale, under a full emission stop, you get at least here below these threshold levels. But it's a binary information, so you are either above or below. It's not a continuous path. Then the time path of impacts, I'm not sure if I have to haste, but here you see that we transformed the graph of stock dynamics into a time-dependent function of affected species. Here we used NOAC data for PFOS in water, and you see that the fraction of affected species that is used as an estimate of impact is quite high. So there is a considerable impact for the local pollution scenario, but if we then implement different risk management options, it might decrease, but still is not gone, assuming that we do not have a radical stop of use. And even then, we might keep over some pollution levels. How is this now moving forward to the top level? We have to contrast it with different cost components. So I just show you here the corresponding routes to the different routes of impact. And we collected for all the 17 substances the available cost data under each of these routes. And this is what is then needed to be transformed or to be included in a cost effectiveness analysis. Now, this is my last slide. What do we learn from it all? First of all, the regulatory decisions under REACH for persistent chemicals are based on socioeconomic analysis. Either on an authorization, there it's a must, and in a restriction, it is a can, but it's highly recommended. Socioeconomic analysis is per se working towards a balancing of benefits and costs. Because these PBTs are stock pollutants, the environmental and human health impacts arise from the stock and not from the emissions. This is what I really put my focus on. That's a key issue. But if you look then into the available restriction dossiers and into the non-black marked, non-confidential parts of socioeconomic analysis under authorization, you see that this is not taken up, not at all. It is more or less largely ignored. Also, the guidance documents do not refer to this in an explicit way. Our argument is therefore, our conclusion is that if we want to have a concern-based evaluation of these substances, we need to start with an assessment of stock dynamics. And that's not a miracle. It's not something which is overcomplicated. It requires maybe some rules for best practice, such that it's harmonized across stakeholders, but this can always be done. If we ignore it, we run the risk that, as you also assumed it today and showed it, that we underestimate the expected impacts because we simply suppress the fact that there is a time scale included. We may also underestimate the costs of control measures because if we present costs for emissions, that's not the fact, that's not the issue. It's the cost that we need to reduce the stock, and that's a different type of thing. And we may overestimate the expected impact of control measures. Taking out emissions is not the same as taking out stock. Now this is the really last slide. What I also would like to point out here is that a concern-based socioeconomic analysis is an interdisciplinary challenge. So I think economists cannot solve it alone because they lack the knowledge on the properties and the behavior of these substances. But also environmental scientists cannot solve it alone because it needs to feed the information, the expertise needs to feed into decision support tools. So there is also a need to, let's say, highlight, explore, practice the nexus between ecotoxicology, biology, ecology, and economics. And the last thing is it's a matter of capacity building, I would say particularly on the side of regulatory agencies. Thanks a lot for your attention, for your invitation, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks a lot for a very, very interesting presentation, Silke. I know we are running late, so if you have to leave, don't feel impolite. But we have time for a couple of questions now, I think. Thomas?
Well, I had two questions. One, you showed the chemical formula of PFAS.